In the dimly lit chapel of Turin's cathedral, a length of ancient linen lies protected behind glass. Upon it, a faint sepia image of a wounded man evokes awe and devotion. Many believe this Shroud of Turin once wrapped the crucified body of Jesus Christ. But as we look into the scientific tests and historical records, a very different story emerges. The journey to uncover the truth plays out like a detective tale. Scientists, historians, and even bishops have all examined this cloth, and the evidence they've uncovered pulls back the veil of mystery. From cutting-edge radiocarbon dating to forensic blood analysis, and from medieval manuscripts to Jewish burial customs, we've dissected every clue. And each clue points to an unmistakable conclusion. The Shroud of Turin is not what believers claim. Our story begins in 1988 when the Shroud of Turin faced a decisive scientific test. Tiny threads of the linen were distributed to 3 separate laboratories in Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona for radiocarbon dating. This technique measures the decay of radioactive carbon to estimate an artifact's age. After months of careful preparation and blinded analysis, all 3 labs arrived at the same startling age for the cloth. The results were unequivocal. The linen dated to somewhere between 1260 and 1390 AD. In other words, the fabric originated in the Middle Ages, more than 1,000 years after the time of Jesus. The conclusion, announced at a packed press conference in 1988, reverberated around the world. The shroud was not the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. It was a shocking moment for those who had revered the relic, yet to many scientists and historians it was the least surprising outcome. After all, the shroud's trail in the historical record only began in the 14th century, right when the carbon dating indicated it was made. Still, the tale of the carbon dating did not end there. Committed believers, unwilling to accept a medieval date, scrambled for explanations. They claimed the labs must have tested a patched corner rather than the original cloth, or that centuries of handling and contamination with newer carbon, like bacteria or fungi, skewed the results. It's true that the single sample for dating was cut from a corner edge, a spot that might have been handled frequently. Could it have been part of a later repair? Years later, a chemist from the original Shroud research team, Raymond Rogers, examined leftover threads purportedly from the same corner. He reported finding traces of cotton fibers and dye in those threads, suggesting a medieval invisible reweave could have been present there. If that were so, the tested sample might not represent the main cloth. It was a provocative hypothesis, and to some it offered a glimmer of hope that the shroud itself could be older. However, this idea of an expertly spliced patch began to unravel under scrutiny. Textile experts, including Mechthild Fleury-Lemberg, who oversaw a detailed restoration of the shroud in 2002, found no evidence of any such reweaving. She flatly rejected the invisible patch theory, noting it would have been technically impossible to repair the linen so perfectly without leaving behind obvious traces. Indeed, photographs and microscopic inspections during the restoration showed a consistent weave in that corner, continuous with the rest of the cloth, not a later fabric insert. What about contamination by newer material? Skeptical researchers calculated how much modern carbon would be needed to throw off the dating by 13 centuries. The answer was astonishing. You would need to add twice as much new carbon by weight as the cloth's material itself to produce such an error. In other words, the shroud would have to be more contamination than cloth, which is clearly not the case. Furthermore, the labs went through a strenuous process to clean the samples and remove surface contaminants before testing. Even the intense heat of a fire in 1532, which scorched the shroud and left charred marks, could not have altered the date by more than a few decades, certainly not over 1,000 years. The consilience of evidence is compelling. The radiocarbon date aligns with the shroud's first appearance in historical records, and no credible scientific challenge has overturned that result. In fact, as one editor of a journal noted in 2019, nothing published since has given a compelling reason to think the 1988 dating was wrong. The simplest explanation holds: this linen was woven in medieval times. Shroud proponents have tried to counter with alternative dating methods. In 2013, for instance, an Italian scientist named Giulio Fanti announced that using infrared spectroscopy and other techniques, he had deduced the shroud's fabric dated to around 300 BC to 400 AD, a range that conveniently brackets the time of Jesus. But these exotic methods raised eyebrows in the scientific community. As Professor Christopher Ramsey of the Oxford Radiocarbon Unit cautioned, those aren't methods that are used for dating in the archaeological community. In other words, Fanti's tests had no established reliability for age-dating ancient linen. It was a novel approach devised specifically to get a desired result. The gold standard of artifact dating, radiocarbon analysis, had already spoken clearly, and so far no amount of special pleading, whether about stray neutrons, bioplastic coatings, or fiber-bending hypotheses, has managed to mute its verdict. If the Shroud of Turin truly wrapped a corpse 2,000 years ago, one might assume its ghostly image resulted from some natural chemical imprint or miraculous burst of energy. On the other hand, if it's a medieval creation, an artist or forger must have crafted it by hand. The Shroud's image is admittedly extraordinary at first glance. It's a full-length front and back imprint of a bearded man who appears to bear wounds consistent with crucifixion. Strangely, it behaves like a photographic negative. The lights and darks are reversed, so that only when photographed and inverted does the figure appear in normal positive light/dark orientation. This was first discovered in 1898 when Secondo Pia took the inaugural photograph of the Shroud and nearly dropped the plate in shock as the distinct face of Christ emerged in the negative. The image also encodes three-dimensional information. Brighter areas seem closer to the cloth, a bit like a depth map. These peculiarities have often been cited by believers as evidence of a miraculous origin, too complex for any artist to have produced, they claim. But is it really impossible for human hands to have created this image? Modern forensic analysis and experimental archaeology say otherwise. Let's start with the bloodstains on the Shroud because they tell a revealing tale. There are reddish marks all over the cloth corresponding to wounds, small punctures on the scalp, as from a crown of thorns, rivulets down the arms and across the back from scourging and nails, and a large stain at the side, as from a spear wound. If these were actual blood from a crucified body that was wrapped in the cloth, they should follow certain patterns dictated by gravity and the realities of wrapping a human corpse. Two researchers, forensic anthropologist Matteo Barini and chemist Luigi Garlascelli, decided to test this by reenacting the supposed scenario. In 2018, they reported the results of painstaking experiments using both a live volunteer and a mannequin. They applied blood, both real and synthetic, to mimic wounds and tried every imaginable position of a body wrapped or draped in cloth. The outcome? They were unable to reproduce the Shroud's bloodstain patterns in any realistic pose. For example, the blood trails on the forearms in the Shroud image run in a direction that doesn't match what you'd get if a man's arms were at the angle of crucifixion or lying flat in burial. The angles contradict each other. As Barini noted, when you look at all the bloodstains just as you would at a crime scene, you realize they contradict each other. The only conclusion is that these blood marks did not occur naturally from a body lying in the cloth. Instead, they appear to have been artificially applied. It's as if an artist painted them on in a way to depict a crucified man, rather than them being the actual transferred blood of a wounded corpse. In fact, the forensic team deemed the stains completely unrealistic for a draped body, strongly suggesting a human origin for the tableau. Now consider the nature of the image itself, apart from the blood. In 1978, a large team of scientists under the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP, spent 5 days examining the cloth with every instrument available, then visible and ultraviolet photography, X-ray fluorescence, infrared spectroscopy, you name it. Their goal was to determine how the image formed. They found something intriguing. The sepia-colored image resides only on the very top surface of the fibers, a microscopically thin layer of discoloration, almost like a scorch or dehydration of the linen fibers. There was no detectable paint binder or dye soaking into the threads that one would expect from brush-applied pigments. This led the STURP team to famously conclude that the image is not painted in any ordinary sense. Pro-Shroud authors often quote STURP as saying no pigments, paints, or dyes were responsible for the image, implying it must be miraculous. However, not all members of STURP agreed on the interpretation, and later independent analyses provided a twist to the plot. One key investigator was Dr. Walter Macrone, a renowned microscopist. Macrone was initially invited to analyze Shroud samples, and unlike some of his colleagues, he focused intently on what the Shroud's fibers were actually coated with. Using polarized light microscopy and chemical tests on the sticky tape samples from the cloth, Macrone identified something unexpected. The Shroud's image appears to be composed of minute particles of pigment. Specifically, he found red ochre, which is iron oxide, and vermilion, or mercuric sulfide. These were common pigments used by artists in the Middle Ages. He also found a binding medium, likely collagen tempera, a gelatin binder that had been used to adhere them. These particles were present in the fibers from the image areas, both body and blood images, but were absent on fibers from non-image areas. In other words, the sepia picture is literally made of paint pigment dust lightly stuck to the fibers. Even more damning, when Macron applied various forensic tests for blood, such as chemical reactions that detect hemoglobin, every test came up negative on the bloodstains. The Shroud's sanguine stains did not behave like real blood at all, but they did match the properties of a paint containing red ochre and vermilion. Macron concluded that a clever artist in the mid-14th century painted the shroud by dusting it with pigments, using a technique akin to a dry paint or rubbing. The style was reminiscent of a grisaille, or monochrome. This was artwork similar to other work styles in that era. He even hypothesized this happened around 1355. Just about the time the shroud first appeared in historical records. His findings were later fully confirmed by additional tests like electron microscopy and X-ray analysis, which also detected the iron and mercury signature of those pigments in the image areas. If the Shroud of Turin were truly the burial cloth of Jesus, one might expect it to have a clear and glorious historical pedigree, perhaps mentioned in the Gospels, celebrated by the early church, or at least consistently tracked through the ages as a sacred relic. Instead, the historical trail of the shroud is suspiciously blank for 13 centuries. The cloth's documented history starts in the mid-1350s in a small French town, and even at its debut it was dogged by accusations of fraud. Let's trace the timeline. According to the New Testament, after Jesus' crucifixion, his body was wrapped for burial, not in one single shroud, but in linen cloths, plural. The Gospel of John, chapter 20, verses 5-7, specifically describes multiple linen wrappings in the tomb, including a separate cloth for the head. This matches standard Jewish burial customs of the first century. The body would be bound in linen strips or sheets with spices, and the face covered with a sudarium, or face cloth. Nowhere is there a mention of an image miraculously left on any of these cloths. In fact, if an image of Jesus had been left on his burial shroud, it surely would have been venerated by the apostles and early Christians with utmost fervor, yet no first century or early Christian document references any such image. The silence is deafening. Early Christians talked of the empty tomb as proof of the resurrection, not an image on a shroud. The first reference to what we now call the Shroud of Turin comes around 1355 in Lirey, France. A French knight, Geoffroy de Charny, displayed a cloth bearing the mysterious image of a crucified man. Pilgrims flocked to see it, venerating it as Jesus' shroud. This was the era when relics were big business. Churches that housed famous relics attracted pilgrims and their donations. With that came a thriving trade in fake relics. By the 14th century, Europe already boasted multiple true cross fragments, assorted nails from the crucifixion, and even, absurdly, several competing holy prepuces, or foreskins, of Christ. It was an age hungry for the tangible touch of the holy, and unscrupulous forgers were happy to oblige. Even against that backdrop, the shroud in Lirey drew attention and skepticism. In 1389, the local bishop of Troyes, Pierre d'Arcy, wrote an indignant memorandum to the Pope at Avignon. In this document, d'Arcy denounced the shroud as a forgery. He recounted how a few decades earlier his predecessor, Bishop Henri de Poitiers, had investigated the relic when it first surfaced. According to d'Arcy, that earlier investigation discovered the artist who had cunningly painted the image and confessed to it. d'Arcy was outraged that despite this, the cloth was still being exhibited to gullible faithful as if it were genuine. He called it a product of human artifice and warned that the church was committing fraud by promoting it. These are not rumors or later libels. We have the text of Bishop d'Arcy's letter preserved in the Vatican archives, and it plainly calls the shroud a painted hoax. The papal response was cautious. Pope Clement VII, unwilling to completely discard an object of popular devotion, forbade any outright claim that the shroud was the true burial cloth of Christ. He decreed it could be shown only with an acknowledgement that it was a man-made figure or representation of the Passion of Christ, not the actual shroud. In essence, even the highest church authority of the time stopped short of asserting the relic's authenticity. Another approach to testing the shroud's authenticity is to determine if it matches what we know of first-century Jewish burial practices and textiles. If this linen really wrapped Jesus of Nazareth, a Jew of the early Roman period, it should be consistent with that context. On this front, the shroud again fails to convince. Firstly, burial practice. The Gospel of John gives a vivid picture of Jesus' entombment. Joseph of Arimathea, and Nicodemus, wrapped the body in linen cloths along with a large quantity of myrrh and aloes, aromatic spices. Importantly, John specifies that a separate cloth covered Jesus' head, often referred to as the sudarium. This detail is significant because it indicates the use of multiple cloths, rather than one single large shroud. Archaeological evidence from Jerusalem in the 1st century backs this up. In 2000, archaeologists discovered the only known intact burial shroud from the time of Jesus in a tomb in Jerusalem's Hinnom Valley, Akeldama. This finding, published after Radiocarbon confirming a 1st century date, revealed how Jews of that era shrouded their dead. The body was wrapped in a simple linen cloth, and a second cloth, in this case made of wool, was used to wrap the head separately, exactly as the Gospel describes. This two-cloth practice was standard, one around the body and one around the head. The Turin shroud, by contrast, is a single rectangular sheet about 14 feet by 3.5 feet in which the body supposedly lay lengthwise and was folded over head to toe. That is not how Jewish burials of the time were typically done for the average person. If one argues Jesus got a unique burial, one still must explain why those who buried him would ignore the customary separate head wrapping. The inconsistency raises eyebrows. Secondly, the textile itself. The Shroud of Turin's linen is a high-quality weave known as a 3-to-1 herringbone twill. It's a complex diagonal pattern that would have been an exceptional piece of cloth in any era. In the Middle East of the 1st century, linens were usually much more modest in weave. The shroud found in the Jerusalem tomb was a plain weave, a simple over and under pattern, with roughly 12 by 8 threads per centimeter, sturdy but basic. In fact, textile experts note that no examples of herringbone twill linen are known from Palestine in the 1st century. Such a weave might have existed somewhere in the Roman Empire, but it would be extremely rare and likely very expensive. Joseph of Arimathea is said to have been a rich man who donated a linen shroud, but even so, the prevalence of simpler weaves in the archaeological record suggests the Turin cloth would be an outlier in that context. Not only that, the shroud cloth contains a mix of flax fibers and some cotton of a Middle Eastern variety. Interestingly, the cotton might hint at a Near Eastern origin of the linen, yet the weave points more toward medieval European weaving techniques, or perhaps those from Syria much later. The leading theory, based on weaving pattern and historical trade, is that the linen could have been produced in medieval Europe, perhaps in France or the Middle East, at a time when complex weaves were more common in luxury textiles. One of the more exotic pieces of evidence shroud enthusiasts often cite involves pollen grains and microscopic dust found on the cloth. The logic goes like this. If the Shroud of Turin had traveled from Jerusalem to France, it might have picked up pollen from plants along the way, or dust specific to certain locales like Jerusalem limestone. In the 1970s, a Swiss criminologist named Max Frey obtained permission to press sticky tapes onto the shroud's surface to collect particles. He later claimed to have identified pollen from a variety of plants, including around 54 species that grow in the Middle East, Israel, Jordan, Turkey, and so on, but not in Europe. To shroud believers, this sounded like a slam dunk. How else would pollen from Jerusalem end up on a cloth kept in France and Italy, unless the cloth had originated in Jerusalem? Adding to the intrigue, Fry also thought he found traces of certain minerals, and even suggested some dust matched the soil around Jerusalem. Over the years, these pollen and dust claims have been repeated often in books and documentaries, as proof that the shroud really was there in the Holy Land. But when these extraordinary claims were scrutinized by other scientists, serious doubts emerged. Pollen analysis is a tricky business. It requires expertise in palynology, the study of pollen grains, and ideally the use of advanced microscopes for proper identification. Frey's work was done with simple light microscopy and, according to experts, left much to be desired in terms of rigor. Von Bryant, a respected palynologist at Texas A&M University, examined Frey's methods and conclusions in detail. He noted that Frey's tape lift samples were not handled with the strict protocols palynologists normally use to avoid contamination. For instance, Frey used ordinary Scotch tape whose adhesive can be very difficult to fully clear of extraneous pollen. There's also the chain of custody issue. After Frey collected the samples, they were in his possession for years, and not all of his data or specimens were made public before he died. Bryant and most other serious scientists remained unconvinced by Frey's pollen evidence, saying they would need to see new pollen samples analyzed under far stricter conditions to accept those results. In 1999, a group of researchers tried to verify Frey's work and did publish a report largely agreeing with him, but they too relied on similar microscopy methods, not the higher fidelity scanning electron microscopy that could conclusively identify the pollen's morphology. This means there's a possibility of misidentification. Some pollens can look similar, and without thorough analysis, one might claim a species is unique to Israel when in fact a related species in Europe produces a similar grain. Additionally, critics point out that even if some Middle Eastern pollen is on the shroud, it doesn't prove the cloth itself ever went there. Pollen can travel on the wind or via human handling. During the Crusades and later, many relics from the Holy Land were brought to Europe, some genuine, many fake, and they could have introduced pollen to other objects. The shroud was displayed and handled by people from all over Christendom. It's not impossible that someone pressed it to other relics or exposed it to environments where foreign pollen was present. In essence, the presence of pollen from native Palestinian plants does not prove the shroud was ever in Palestine. It is suggestive at best, but far from conclusive. And given the questions around phrase methodology, it's equally plausible that the pollen evidence is simply flawed or even contaminated by the examiner. Skeptical investigators like Joe Nickel have gone further, suggesting that Frey, who badly wanted to prove the shroud's authenticity, may have been less than objective. Nickel noted that despite Frey's claim of many exotic pollen types, independent researchers haven't found more than a negligible amount of such pollen on shroud samples, raising suspicions that Frey's results were at least partly wishful thinking, pseudoscience, or even pious fraud. That might be harsh, but it underscores how unsubstantiated the pollen claims remain in mainstream science. If you enjoy our content, we'd love your support. By joining one of our channel memberships, you help us continue creating videos like this one while gaining access to some amazing perks. As a member, you'll unlock exclusive content available only to supporters, earn loyalty badges to show off in comments and live chats, and enjoy priority responses to your comments, shoutouts, and more. The best part? Memberships start at just $2.99 a month, less than a cup of coffee. Even small contributions make a big difference for the PJ Bible TV team in covering production costs and delivering the content you love. And if you're not ready to become a channel member today but still want to support us, there are other ways to help. Engaging with our videos is a tremendous way to show your support. By taking just a few moments to like the video, share it with friends, family, or on social media, and leave a comment, you're telling the YouTube algorithm to share our content with more people. Your support, no matter how you choose to show it, means the world to us. Thank you for being part of the PJ Bible TV community.